The Wicker Mask. It was Halloween night at the old Miller farm, a property that had been abandoned for decades. During the day, children from the nearby town played around the fields, but when night fell, everything changed. The farm seemed to have a different air, as if it were waiting for something or someone. The scarecrow, placed there by the former residents, was made of woven wicker and old clothes. But on that night, something new was noticed. There was a mask woven onto its face, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Some said the scarecrow had come to life. 3 friends, Jake, Sam, and Lily, decided to explore the farm that Halloween night. They laughed at the legends, thinking it was all just stories told by the older folks to scare them. But as they got closer to the field, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Jake led the way with a flickering flashlight. Sam, always the brave one, followed a bit behind, and Lily, the most skeptical, reluctantly trailed along. They approached the scarecrow. It looked so ordinary during the day, but something in its dark eyes seemed to shine in the flashlight's beam. Sam teased the others, saying he would touch the scarecrow. He reached out, and at that moment, the scarecrow moved. Lily screamed, but before the sound could leave her throat, the flashlight flickered wildly. The wicker mask seemed to move on its own, glowing eerily. Suddenly, Jake realized something was wrong. The scarecrow was walking towards them, its steps dry and dragging. They started to run, but the scarecrow didn't seem to need speed, just presence. The night was silent, except for the rustling leaves and the sound of dry footsteps. They hid in the old farmhouse, breathing heavily. Jake held the door while Sam and Lily searched for something to defend themselves. Then they heard a whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but it was clear the sound came from something outside, the scarecrow. Lily looked out the window. The wicker mask was glowing with a hungry look. It stopped in front of the door, and the whisper grew louder, like a hypnotic chant. Sam, who had always been the bravest, began walking towards the door as if in a trance. Jake tried to hold him back, but it was too late. Sam opened the door, and all they could see was the mask. The glow in the scarecrow's eyes intensified, and the last thing Lily heard was the dry sound of something being dragged. She knew she couldn't stay there. She ran for the back exit, but she felt something following her. The farm was engulfed in an almost solid darkness. Lily ran across the fields until she saw the town lights in the distance. She didn't look back, but she could feel the scarecrow watching her. When she finally reached the edge of the farm, everything was quiet. Jake and Sam were no longer with her. The next day, the police found Lily sitting by the roadside, shaking and unable to speak. At the farm, there was no sign of the boys, just a scarecrow. But its wicker mask now had something different. To human eyes was sewn in where there had only been darkness before. Lily never spoke of that night again, but every Halloween night, the farm seemed to come to life again. They said that if you looked closely, you could see the scarecrow moving, as if searching for something or someone who escaped. The Mask of Firetails. It was a tradition in the small town, gathering around a bonfire in the woods on Halloween night. The young people would gather, tell stories, and laugh at the fear they provoked in each other. But there was one story all one wanted to tell, the story of the man with the fire mask. They said the man with the fire mask was a spirit that manifested when his name was spoken around the fire, an entity that burned from within, with a face made of coal and ash. But that night, amidst laughter and teasing, one of the boys, Tom, decided to challenge the legend. He said the name aloud, and the bonfire seemed to react. The flames flickered, the wind stopped, and an eerie silence took over. The friends laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Then, something cracked in the brush. They all looked around, but there was nothing, at least nothing they could see. The flames began to die down, and a figure appeared on the other side of the bonfire. A tall man, with a mask made of coal and fire. His eyes glowed like embers, and his presence made the air grow cold. No one could move. Tom tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. The man with the fire mask stepped towards the group, and the bonfire went out completely. Everything was dark, except for the glowing eyes that were now very close. The friends felt the cold and fear creep over their bodies, and then they heard the voice, a low whisper, like the crackling of burning wood. "You called me," he said, and his words seemed to be whispers inside the minds of the young people. Panic set in, and each of them started running in different directions, trying to escape the figure that seemed to move without making a sound. But the darkness was total, and no one knew where they were going. Tom tripped and fell, feeling the cold forest floor against his face. When he tried to get up, he saw the mask in front of him. The glow in the man's eyes was more intense, and all Tom could do was scream before disappearing into the darkness. As the other friends ran through the woods, they could hear the sound of fire, even though there were no more flames. Every step seemed to echo, and the feeling of being watched consumed them. The masked figure appeared and disappeared between the trees, always lurking. Lucy, one of the friends, managed to reach a clearing. She looked around, trying to figure out if she was safe. But when she heard the soft sound of wood breaking, her heart sank. The man with the fire mask was there, standing next to her, his eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to consume everything around him. She didn't have time to scream. The mask approached, and everything went dark. The next day, the bonfire was found still smoldering, and there was no sign of the young people. Only burned marks on the ground, and a mask made of coal that had burned to ashes. The town never held another Halloween bonfire, but on the darkest nights, you could still hear the whispers of the man with the fire mask. The lurker of the haunted fair. It was a Halloween fair, abandoned 4 years, forgotten on a back road. The stalls were falling apart, the rides were rusted, and the Ferris wheel no longer worked. But for a group of friends, it was the perfect place to explore on Halloween night. They arrived at the fair just before midnight. The air was cold, and the wind made the rusty rides creak. There was a heavy atmosphere, as if the place had been waiting for them. The remaining lights flickered, giving the place an even more eerie feel. Jenny, Mark, and Alex walked through the stalls, laughing nervously. They knew the stories about the lurker of the fair, a masked man who hid among the rides and, every Halloween, chose a new victim for his collection. But, of course, to them, it was just tales to scare kids. As they advanced, Mark noticed something strange. One of the stalls seemed better preserved than the others, and inside it, he saw a mask hanging, a scarecrow mask with dark, empty eyes. When he called the others to see, the mask was no longer there. Jenny laughed, saying he must have imagined it. But when she turned around, she saw a figure in the distance, standing near the Ferris wheel. It was wearing the scarecrow mask, and its eyes seemed to follow their every move. Alex grabbed a flashlight and pointed it at the figure, but no one was there. The wind picked up, and the sound of creaking rides grew louder. The lurker was there, somewhere, watching them. Jenny began to feel uneasy and suggested they leave. But Mark, always the bravest, wanted to keep exploring. They walked towards the Ferris wheel. Mark climbed the rusted structure, trying to prove he wasn't scared. But when he reached the top, he saw the mask again, this time right next to him. He heard a whisper, a cold, low sound that said, "You shouldn't be here." Before he could react, the Ferris wheel began to shake. Jenny and Alex, who were on the ground, saw the masked figure climbing the wheel, moving towards Mark. Its steps were silent, and the mask seemed to glow in the moonlight. Mark screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the wind and the creaking of the structure. Jenny and Alex started running, trying to find a way out of that cursed place. They heard the sound of something falling, and knew Mark was no longer with them. When they finally reached the car, they realized they were alone. There was no sign of Mark, and the fair was completely silent. They looked back one last time and saw the Ferris wheel standing still. At the top, The masked figure watched them, as if saying goodbye. The next day, the police found Mark's body at the base of the Ferris wheel. His eyes were wide open, and a strange smile was on his face. The scarecrow mask was never found, and the fair was shut down. But every year, on Halloween night, they say you can still hear the sound of creaking rides and see the masked figure lurking among the stalls. The executioner's mask house. At the end of the dark street, there was an abandoned house that everyone avoided. They said anyone who entered would never be the same again. But 3 friends, Peter, Amanda, and Lucas, decided to test their courage and enter the house, not believing in the legend of the executioner's mask. After all, it was just Halloween stories. As soon as they passed through the door, the air grew heavy, and a smell of mold mixed with something worse surrounded them. In the center of the room, a black mask, resembling that of a medieval executioner, sat on a pedestal. The mask seemed to watch each of them, even without eyes. Lucas, the bravest, decided to approach the mask. He picked it up in his hands, feeling a chill run down his spine. Amanda begged him to stop playing around, but Lucas laughed, putting the mask on his face. As soon as he did, the house doors slammed shut. Darkness consumed the room, and the sound of chains echoed through the walls. Peter turned on his flashlight, only to see Lucas standing still, now with the mask stuck to his face. His eyes were glazed over, and he began to mutter words no one could understand. The voice coming from him was cold, like a winter wind. Amanda tried to pull the mask off Lucas's face, but it was as if it had fused with his skin. Suddenly, Lucas raised his head, and his eyes were as black as night. He smiled, but he was no longer himself. Something inside the mask had taken over his body. Peter pulled Amanda back, and the two started running through the house. Each hallway seemed to lead them further into the house. The walls seemed to move, and the sound of chains grew closer. Lucas, or whatever he had become, followed them slowly, dragging his feet and holding an axe he had found somewhere in the house. Peter and Amanda reached a room, locking the door behind them. Amanda was in tears, and Peter tried to find a way out. That's when they noticed something written on the walls, in an ancient language. The words seemed to glow in the flashlight's beam, and Amanda whispered, "It's a ritual. We need to finish the ritual." They began reciting the words, even though they didn't understand what they meant. Outside, Lucas's footsteps grew louder, and the sound of chains echoed throughout the house. When the door finally opened, Peter shouted the last words of the ritual, and everything went silent. Lucas collapsed to the floor, the mask falling off his face. He looked confused, as if he had woken up from a nightmare. Amanda ran to him, and Peter grabbed the mask, determined to end it once and for all. He threw it to the ground and, with a piece of wood, smashed it to pieces. The house seemed to breathe, as if a weight had been lifted. The doors opened, and the 3 friends ran outside, without looking back. They never returned to that house, but they knew something was still there. The executioner's mask may have been destroyed, but the evil that inhabited that house still waited for new visitors. The man with the skull mask. It was a typical Halloween party, full of masks, laughter, and loud music. Everyone was having fun, but one figure stood out, a man wearing a skull mask. He didn't dance, didn't talk, just observed. He seemed to know everyone, always nearby, like a friend you didn't remember inviting. The party was in full swing, and no one paid much attention to the man with the skull mask. He moved through the corners, watching the guests. When someone asked who he was, he just pointed to the mask, without saying a word. Some laughed, thinking it was part of the game. However, when one of the guests, Sarah, stepped outside to get something from her car, she felt a presence. The man with the skull mask was there, beside her, his dark eyes behind the mask watching her. Sarah tried to ignore him, thinking it was just someone playing a prank, but when she turned around, he was closer, so close she could feel his cold breath. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice so low it was like an echo. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The man raised his hand, and everything around seemed to freeze. Inside the house, the other guests continued the party, unaware that Sarah hadn't returned. The man with the skull mask reappeared among them, now with an even more sinister presence. He moved slowly, as if choosing his next victim. Jake, one of Sarah's friends, noticed she was taking too long. He went out to look for her, but all he found was the car, with the door open and the lights on. There was no sign of Sarah, just a strange silence that seemed to surround everything. When he turned back to the house, the man with the skull mask was standing in the doorway, watching him. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong, and he knew he needed to get out of there. He ran back inside, trying to warn the others, but the music was too loud, and no one heard him. The masked man stood in the middle of the room, his dark eyes following Jake's every move. Jake tried to pull his friends away, but it was as if no one could see him. The masked figure moved closer, and Jake knew that, if he didn't leave, it would be too late. He ran for the exit, hearing the sound of the mask moving behind him. When he finally got out of the house, he looked back and saw the man with the skull mask standing in the doorway, as if saying goodbye. The next day, no one remembered the masked man. Everyone thought Sarah had left early, and no one seemed to notice Jake's absence. The house was silent, and the skull mask had disappeared. But somewhere, the man with the skull mask was still there, waiting for his next party. The pumpkin harvest visitor. In a secluded pumpkin field, something lurked. A tall figure with a mask made from a shriveled pumpkin. The farmer said it was the guardian of the harvest. Whoever entered the field after dark was taken, and the pumpkins grew larger in the next season. The friends, Tom, Emily, and Ben, decided to explore the field on Halloween night. They laughed at the legend, thinking it was just a silly story to keep people away. But as they walked through the pumpkin field, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The wind blew, and the pumpkin leaves made a strange sound, almost like whispers. Tom led the group, lighting the way with his flashlight. They saw something move among the pumpkins, a shadow that seemed to hide whenever the light got close. Ben started to get nervous, suggesting maybe they should go back, but Tom wanted to prove there was nothing there. He approached a large pumpkin in the middle of the field, and as he bent down, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a mask made of pumpkin, with carved eyes that seemed to be alive. Before he could say anything, the mask moved. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, wearing the pumpkin mask on its face. Its eyes glowed, and it moved slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. Emily screamed, and Ben started running, but Tom was frozen. The figure approached, and all Tom could do was watch as it grabbed him. Emily and Ben ran through the field, but there seemed to be no end. The pumpkins around them seemed to grow, blocking the path. They could hear the steps of the masked figure, always behind them, as if it were playing. Ben tripped and fell, and when Emily looked back, she saw the mask glowing in the darkness. Emily managed to reach the fence of the field, climbing it quickly. She looked back and saw Ben being dragged away by the figure, his screams echoing through the field. She knew there was nothing she could do, and she ran to the road without looking back. When she finally reached the town, she was breathless and in tears. The next day, the police found only pumpkins in the field. There was no sign of Tom or Ben, but two new giant pumpkins stood in the center of the field, with strange markings on their shells. Emily never returned there, but she knew the guardian was still waiting, tending to his harvest. The Labyrinth Keeper. In a corn maze meant for families to enjoy during Halloween, something else was hidden. The Labyrinth Keeper, a masked being, lurked, ready for those who got lost after sunset. They said he ensured no one left without leaving something behind. A group of friends, Alex, Megan, and Chris, decided to enter the maze at night, defying the legend of the keeper. They laughed as they walked through the tall corn stalks, thinking it would be easy to find the exit. But as they went further, they realized they were getting lost. The wind blew through the corn, and the sound seemed to form words, as if someone were whispering. Megan started feeling uneasy, saying something was wrong. Alex laughed, but soon noticed that Chris was no longer with them. They called for him, but all they heard was the sound of the wind. Megan's flashlight began to flicker, and they heard soft footsteps behind them. Alex turned quickly, shining the light, but there was nothing there. "We need to get out of here," Megan said, gripping Alex's arm. They started running, but it seemed like the maze was changing, the paths closing and new ones appearing. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of them. The labyrinth keeper wore a mask made of dried leaves and twigs, and his eyes glowed with a cold light. He didn't say anything, just raised his hand, pointing at Megan. Alex tried to pull her, but Megan seemed stuck, as if her legs wouldn't obey. "You entered without permission," the keeper whispered, his voice like the rustling of leaves. Megan began to be pulled back, and Alex couldn't hold on to her. He watched the masked figure disappear into the corn, taking his friend. Terror overwhelmed Alex, and he ran, trying to find the exit. When he finally made it out of the maze, the sun was rising. He looked back, but there was no sign of Megan or Chris. The maze was silent, as if nothing had happened. However, Alex knew that something, or someone, was still in there, guarding the place. The Masked Hunter, a killer who always wore a different mask every Halloween. He blended into parties, pretending to be just another guest. His next victim was chosen when no one was paying attention. Each mask was made from the face of someone he had taken in the past. That night, a party full of masked guests was happening at Ashley's house. Everyone was having fun, dancing and drinking. No one noticed when a masked man entered, wearing a detailed mask that seemed almost real. He moved through the guests, watching each one. His eyes, behind the mask, were cold and calculating. He chose his victim, a girl named Claire, who was laughing with her friends near the fireplace. He slowly approached, blending into the group, until he managed to be alone with her. Claire thought he was just another guest and laughed when he started dancing strangely. But when he pulled her out of the room, something inside her told her something was wrong. She tried to pull away, but he gripped her arm tightly, and she felt the cold mask against her skin. "Why are you doing this?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. The masked man didn't answer. He just led her outside, where the darkness of the night seemed to swallow everything. Her friends didn't realize she had disappeared until much later. The next morning, a new mask appeared in the hunter's collection. It was Claire's mask, her eyes now hollow and her smile frozen. The party continued, and no one ever knew what really happened to her. But the masked hunter was still out there, waiting for his next victim. The porcelain doll that walks. A masked figure with a porcelain doll mask was seen on the streets during Halloween. She moved slowly, with a tinkling sound, always following someone who was alone. At each corner, she got closer, and the tinkling grew louder. It was a quiet Halloween night, and Lisa was walking home after a party. The streets were almost deserted, and the wind blew softly. That's when she heard the sound, a soft tinkling, like porcelain clinking. She looked back but saw nothing. Lisa kept walking, but the sound persisted. At each corner she turned, the tinkling seemed closer. She started feeling her heart race, and fear began to creep in. When she finally turned again, she saw the figure, a woman wearing a porcelain doll mask. The mask was pale, with empty eyes and a soft smile. The figure stood still, watching Lisa. She tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. The figure took a step towards her, and the sound of tinkling porcelain echoed through the street. Lisa turned and started running, her heart pounding. She turned another corner, trying to get away from the figure, but the tinkling was there, always close, always constant. When she finally reached her house, she locked the door behind her, panting. She looked out the window, but there was no one there. The silence was absolute. But when she turned, the sound returned, the soft tinkling. Now inside her house, Lisa was never seen again. The next day, her neighbors found only a porcelain mask on the floor of her living room, with a soft smile etched into it. The Whisper Collector. On Halloween night, a masked man roamed the streets of a small village. He hid in the shadows, waiting for those who dared to walk down dark alleys. They said he collected whispers, secrets stolen from his victims, secrets that should never be told. It was midnight when Daniel, returning from a party, decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley. He didn't believe in horror stories, and the quiet of the night seemed comforting. But as he walked, he felt a chill, as if something were watching him. That's when he heard the whisper, a low sound, like words being spoken to the wind. Daniel stopped, looking around, but saw no one. The sound seemed to come from all sides, surrounding him. He tried to keep walking, but his feet felt heavy, and fear began to rise. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man wearing a pale, expressionless mask. His eyes were dark, and he approached slowly, his footsteps silent as the night itself. "What's your secret?" he whispered, his voice cold and empty. Daniel tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. The masked man moved closer, and Daniel felt the cold creeping into his body. The whisper grew louder, echoing inside his mind, and he couldn't think of anything else. When he finally managed to speak, he revealed a secret he had never told anyone. The masked man smiled, and everything went dark. The next morning, Daniel was found unconscious in the alley, with no memory of what had happened. But every Halloween night, he still heard the whispers, secrets that should never have been told, secrets that now belonged to the collector. Love spine-chilling horror stories? Subscribe to the channel now and never miss out on the next terrifying tale. Hit that bell icon so you're always the first to know when a new story drops. Let's dive into the fear together.